My fiancé kept pressuring me to sign a prenup just in case, so I had my lawyer add a clause he definitely didn't read. When Derek proposed, I thought I'd won the lottery. He was charming, successful, and came from old money, the kind of family that owned half the businesses in our town. His mother wore pearls to grocery stores, and his father collected vintage cars worth more than most people's houses. Their mansion sat on 50 acres with gardens that required a full-time staff of 6 groundskeepers, 2 gardeners, and a landscape architect who came by weekly. Derek himself drove a Tesla that cost more than I made in 2 years teaching elementary school, and he treated expensive dinners like most people treat McDonald's. We met at a charity fundraiser for childhood literacy, where I was volunteering my Saturday to help set up silent auction tables. He was being honored for his family's substantial donation, $50,000 that probably felt like pocket change to them. He approached me while I was arranging gift baskets and complimented my work with genuine warmth. Most wealthy donors barely acknowledge the volunteers, but Derek actually sat down and asked about my teaching experience. He swept me off my feet with expensive dinners at restaurants I couldn't even pronounce, weekend trips to his family's lake house nestled in the mountains, and thoughtful gifts that showed he actually listened when I talked about my students or my dreams of traveling to Europe someday. For the first time in my 32 years, I felt like someone's genuine priority instead of an afterthought. The proposal was straight out of a fairy tale romance novel. He rented out the entire botanical garden where we'd had our first real heart-to-heart conversation about our childhoods and dreams. He hired a string quartet to play my favorite classical pieces, had the paths lined with thousands of white roses, and got down on one knee surrounded by more flowers than I'd seen at most weddings. The ring was a family heirloom, a 3-carat diamond that had belonged to his great-grandmother, with smaller diamonds forming delicate vines around the band. When I said yes, he spun me around and whispered that he couldn't wait to spend forever with me and build the life we'd dreamed about together. The engagement period started like something from a romantic movie. Derek showered me with attention and gifts. He took me shopping for designer clothes because he wanted me to feel confident at family events. He introduced me to his social circle with obvious pride, always keeping his arm around me and bragging about my work with underprivileged children. His friends seemed genuinely impressed that he'd found someone so different from his usual social circle. 3 months into our engagement, Derek started bringing up the prenup, not casually, obsessively. Every conversation somehow circled back to protecting his family's assets, just in case things didn't work out down the road. He'd laugh it off, saying it was standard procedure for people in his financial position, but something about his insistence felt increasingly wrong. The way his eyes would narrow slightly when I hesitated or asked questions. How he'd bring it up during romantic dinners at intimate restaurants, completely ruining the mood and making me feel like a gold digger for even existing. How he'd compare me to women he'd read about in the news who had taken advantage of wealthy men, making it crystal clear he thought all women were potential threats to his inheritance. The first major red flag should have been when he insisted we keep completely separate bank accounts after marriage. When I gently suggested we might want to share some financial decisions like normal married couples do, he got visibly defensive and said that kind of thinking was exactly why prenups existed in the first place. When I mentioned that my parents had always made financial decisions together, and it had worked well for their 40-year marriage, he actually laughed and said that was probably why so many middle-class marriages failed. Too much emotional decision-making instead of practical business sense. Another warning sign came when he started controlling smaller aspects of my life. He suggested I might want to find a new hairdresser because mine wasn't quite right for someone in his social circle. He bought me a completely new wardrobe without asking, claiming my teaching clothes weren't appropriate for family events. When I protested that I loved some of my old dresses, he said I could keep them for school but shouldn't wear them when we were together socially. I should have trusted my instincts when his college friends made increasingly uncomfortable jokes about his previous relationships during our engagement party. Apparently, Derek had a well-established pattern of long relationships that ended abruptly right before marriage. His fraternity brother James actually laughed and said Derek had serious commitment issues, especially when things got too real or permanent. Another friend mentioned that Derek had never introduced any previous girlfriend to his parents until me, which should have been flattering but somehow felt ominous. But Derek just smiled mysteriously and changed the subject to golf plans or business opportunities. I was too in love and too flattered by being the chosen one to pay attention to the red flags waving frantically right in front of my face. Another major warning sign came when I met his ex-girlfriend Amanda at a country club charity event. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and from a wealthy family herself. She pulled me aside during cocktail hour and said she was genuinely happy Derek had found someone, but then added something that made my stomach turn. She said I seemed different from his usual type, and when I asked what she meant, she hesitated before saying he usually dated women who were more financially dependent on him or had less education. She looked like she wanted to say more, but Derek appeared with drinks and she quickly excused herself. Later that night, when I asked Derek about Amanda, he dismissed her as jealous and bitter about their breakup. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a romantic dinner with his parents at their exclusive country club, the kind of place where you needed 3 current member recommendations just to eat lunch, where the waiting list for membership was longer than most people's mortgages, and where they employed more staff than some small towns. The dining room was all dark mahogany wood and crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my annual salary, with oil paintings of long-dead rich patriarchs staring down at us with disapproving expressions. His mother slid a thick manila envelope across the pristine white linen tablecloth with a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. Her diamond bracelet caught the candlelight as she pushed it toward me, and I noticed she was wearing more jewelry than I'd see in most high-end stores. The bracelet alone probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. "This is just a formality, dear," she said in that fake sweet voice wealthy women perfect when they're about to destroy someone's life. "Every woman who marries into this family signs one. It's been our tradition for generations, and it's protected us from so many unfortunate situations over the years." I'm sure you understand the importance of protecting family assets. The way she said unfortunate situations made my skin crawl. Like women were natural disasters to be weathered, rather than people to be loved and cherished as family members. His father leaned forward across the table, swirling his brandy in a crystal glass that probably cost more than my monthly rent. You have to understand our unique position, he said in his practiced boardroom voice. We've built this wealth over 4 generations through careful planning, strategic investments, and advantageous marriages. We simply can't have it scattered to the winds every time someone gets divorced on a whim or changes their mind about commitment. I opened the document right there at the elegant table and nearly choked on my wine. The prenup was absolutely brutal. 47 pages of dense legal jargon specifically designed to strip me of everything I might ever dream of claiming. If we divorced for any reason, I'd leave with nothing, not even my own personal belongings purchased during the marriage with my own teaching salary. I wouldn't be entitled to alimony regardless of circumstances, property division of any kind, or even my car if it was registered jointly for insurance purposes. The language was so harsh and one-sided it felt like they were already planning for divorce before we'd even gotten married. But the truly horrifying part was buried on page 32 in dense legal language. Any children would remain exclusively with Derek's family if we separated for any reason. I'd have supervised visitation only, and only if I could prove I was emotionally stable according to their family physician and a court-appointed psychiatrist. The document actually included detailed language about how children needed financial stability and educational opportunities that I apparently couldn't provide on a teacher's modest salary. There were dozens of other devastating details that became clear as I read through the nightmare document. I'd be required to sign over my teacher's pension contributions to a joint account controlled entirely by Derek. Any gifts I received from my own family or friends worth over $500 would automatically become marital property. I'd have to get Derek's written permission to make any purchases over $200, including groceries or clothing. Even my existing student loan debt would remain solely my responsibility, while any assets I brought to the marriage, including my small house, would be considered joint property that could be claimed by his family. Derek shrugged casually when I confronted him later that night in his luxury apartment overlooking the city skyline. It's standard stuff, really. My family's lawyer wrote it up based on what's worked successfully for our family before. Just sign it so we can move forward with the wedding planning. Everyone's getting impatient and we've already put substantial deposits down on everything. The phrase worked for our family before made my stomach turn violently. How many women had they done this exact same thing to? And what had happened to those women afterward when they were inevitably discarded with nothing to show for years of their lives? That night, I couldn't sleep despite the expensive silk sheets in Derek's guest room. I kept thinking about how drastically Derek had changed since the proposal, becoming more controlling and dismissive of my opinions, dreams, and basic autonomy. How he'd started making major decisions about our wedding without consulting me at all. The venue had to be their country club because it was sacred family tradition going back generations. The menu had to be approved by his mother, who systematically vetoed everything I suggested as too common, too ethnic, or inappropriate for their refined social circle. Even my wedding dress had to meet their exacting standards of what was appropriate for a proper family wedding. When I showed them the dress I'd fallen in love with at a bridal boutique, his mother actually wrinkled her nose in disgust and said it was far too revealing for a respectable ceremony. How he'd started pressuring me to quit my teaching job after we married because wives in his family didn't need to work outside the home. Their job was supporting their husbands' careers and raising children properly according to family values and traditions that had worked successfully for generations. When I protested that I genuinely loved teaching and my students needed consistency and care, he said I could volunteer at charity events instead, since it would look much better for his business reputation anyway. I remembered the increasingly weird conversation with his cousin Rita at our lavish engagement party. She'd pulled me aside while Derek was getting drinks and warned me in hushed tones that Derek's family was complicated in ways I didn't understand yet, and probably couldn't imagine. When I pressed her for specific details, she glanced around nervously and said to be very careful, that not everything was what it seemed with their marriages and relationships. She mentioned something vague about how Derek's aunt had left the family years ago under mysterious circumstances and been completely cut off financially and socially, but no one was allowed to talk about why or what had really happened. Then she walked away quickly before I could ask what she meant or get more information. Now I was beginning to understand why she'd looked so genuinely frightened. The next morning, I called my own lawyer, someone Derek didn't know about and couldn't influence. Margaret Chen had helped me navigate my father's complicated estate when he passed away unexpectedly, and I trusted her completely with sensitive legal matters. She was a small-town attorney without fancy connections, but she was sharp as a razor and had a hard-earned reputation for never backing down from anyone, no matter how wealthy or powerful they thought they were. When I showed her the prenup document, her eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "This is specifically designed to trap you in an abusive situation," she said, flipping through the pages with increasing alarm and obvious disgust. "This isn't legal protection. It's systematic predatory behavior disguised as standard business practice. Look at this clause about emotional stability evaluations. They could have you declared mentally unfit for literally anything they wanted, spending too much money, disagreeing with family decisions, even showing normal human emotions during stressful situations. And this section about property rights is absolutely unconscionable. They could claim gifts you received before marriage if they're worth over $1,000, including family heirlooms." Margaret spent the next 2 intensive weeks researching Derek's family history and crafting our strategic response. What she discovered through public records, court documents, and private investigation made my blood run completely cold. The family had a thoroughly documented history of predatory marriages going back 3 full generations. Derek's grandfather had perfected this exact system during the Great Depression, systematically targeting desperate women and stealing their family properties through elaborate fraudulent marriage schemes. His father had modernized and refined the approach for contemporary times, focusing specifically on professional women with modest assets and spotless reputations who could enhance the family's social standing while being financially exploited. She crafted a response document with every single clause Derek had demanded, plus one tiny but crucial addition buried deep in the dense legal jargon where no casual reader would think to look carefully or question the language. Section 47C, subsection 12, line 43. The wording was so technical and deliberately obscure that it would take an extremely careful read by someone who knew exactly what to look for to even understand what it actually meant. If Derek committed adultery during our marriage, specifically defined as maintaining any romantic, sexual, or intimate emotional relationship outside the marriage, he would immediately forfeit his entire inheritance to me. Everything. His substantial trust fund, his significant stake in the family business, his multiple properties, even his precious car collection that he valued more than most relationships. The clause was absolutely ironclad and used the exact same complex legal language and formatting as the rest of the document to avoid any suspicion. When I handed Derek the revised prenup at dinner the following week, he barely glanced at the thick document before signing it with a confident flourish. His smug, satisfied smile said everything about how little he respected my intelligence or ability to understand complex legal documents. See? That wasn't so difficult after all, he said, pouring himself more expensive wine. I knew you'd come around once you realize this is simply how things work in my world. My parents will be tremendously relieved. Mother was actually worried you might be one of those women who thinks marriage is about romance and feelings instead of practical business partnership. But 3 weeks before our wedding, while addressing hundreds of cream-colored invitations in his luxury apartment, I discovered Derek's devastating secret, and everything changed forever. I decided to surprise him with lunch from his favorite upscale deli downtown, the kind of place where a simple sandwich costs $40. His doorman knew me well by then and always greeted me warmly, so he let me up to the penthouse without calling ahead like he usually did for other visitors. When I used my key to enter the apartment quietly, I immediately heard voices coming from the master bedroom, Derek's familiar voice, and another woman's voice that I didn't recognize but that sounded intimate, comfortable, and completely at home. I stood frozen in the marble entryway, listening to them casually discuss their detailed weekend plans like an established couple. She'd been his girlfriend for over 2 years, significantly longer than I'd even known Derek existed. They talked about their recent romantic trip to Napa Valley, the same exact weekend Derek had told me he was visiting his sick grandmother in Philadelphia. I remembered how he'd sent me photos of depressing hospital corridors and complained about how emotionally draining the visit was. Apparently, he'd actually been wine tasting at luxury resorts and staying in 5-star hotels with his real girlfriend. They discussed in detail how our upcoming marriage was just an elaborate show, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to make him appear settled and responsible before his father handed over full control of the family business empire when he retired next year. The marriage would give him instant legitimacy in conservative social circles and with traditional business partners who valued family stability and moral character above all else. The woman, Victoria, actually laughed with genuine amusement about the prenup situation. She said Derek had shown it to her the previous night, bragging extensively about how he'd convinced another naive woman to sign away her entire life for the mere illusion of love and financial security. Poor little teacher, she said with cruel amusement in her voice. She has absolutely no idea what she's walking into. Does she really think someone like Derek would marry down economically unless there was a much bigger plan involved? I mean, seriously, look at his entire dating history. He's never been with anyone who wasn't either wealthy themselves or somehow useful to his family's interests. Derek agreed with a chuckle that made my blood freeze in my veins. Once we're officially married and I have complete control of the trust fund, I'll have total financial independence from the old man's restrictions. She can play house and host dinner parties while we continue our real relationship without any interference. The marriage gives me social legitimacy and business credibility, and the prenup ensures she can't touch anything that actually matters when I eventually divorce her. Victoria asked about his specific timeline for the scheme, and Derek explained his detailed 5-year plan like he was discussing a corporate merger or real estate acquisition. Marry me to satisfy his family's social expectations and gain access to his full substantial inheritance. Use the stable marriage to convince his father to hand over business control within 18 to 24 months. Have a child or two to cement the family legacy and make me even more emotionally and financially invested in staying trapped. Then systematically manufacture a messy divorce based on my supposed emotional instability, infidelity, or inability to handle the pressures of their social circle, something his family physician was already prepared to document extensively if needed. They'd retain custody of any children, naturally, citing my mental health issues and complete financial instability. I'd be discarded with absolutely nothing to show for years of my life except trauma, debt, and destroyed reputation. The casual cruelty in their voices was absolutely breathtaking. They talked about systematically destroying my life like they were planning a vacation itinerary. Victoria asked what would happen if I refused to have children or somehow figured out what was happening before the plan was complete. Derek laughed confidently and said that's exactly what the prenup was for. It made me essentially powerless no matter what I discovered or how I tried to fight back. Even if I tried to leave early, I'd have nothing and no realistic way to prove what they'd done to me. The conversation continued with Derek describing previous victims. He casually mentioned a social worker named Jennifer who'd attempted suicide after he'd destroyed her finances and reputation, a nurse named Patricia who'd lost custody of her daughter when his family manufactured evidence of substance abuse. He talked about these women like they were business transactions that had gone according to plan. I backed out of the apartment silently, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my purse. My entire world had collapsed in the space of 15 minutes. The man I thought I loved, the future I'd imagined, the family I'd hoped to build. All of it was an elaborate lie designed to destroy me financially and emotionally. Instead of confronting them immediately, I went straight to Margaret's law office. "We have him completely," Margaret said after I explained everything through tears of rage and heartbreak. "The adultery clause kicks in the moment he says I do while maintaining another relationship. But we need absolutely solid evidence that would hold up against his family's expensive lawyers and political connections." But I wanted much more than just the money. I wanted complete justice for every woman his family had systematically destroyed over the years, and I strongly suspected there had been many more victims than I knew about. I spent the next 3 weeks playing the perfect excited fiancé while secretly gathering devastating evidence. I smiled brightly at dress fittings while my heart was breaking into pieces. I nodded enthusiastically during elaborate cake tastings while planning my revenge. I pretended to be thrilled about our honeymoon plans to the Maldives while hiring a private investigator. Meanwhile, I was systematically building a case that would completely destroy him and expose his entire family's criminal enterprise. The private investigator Margaret recommended was a former police detective named Harris, who specialized in white-collar crime, fraud cases, and wealthy family scandals. He was expensive but absolutely thorough. He documented Derek and Victoria's relationship in excruciating detail over the following weeks. Hotel receipts going back 18 months showing romantic getaways, restaurant photos from intimate dinners at expensive establishments, joint credit cards and shared apartment leases, vacation photos on social media that directly contradicted Derek's timeline of when they'd supposedly met. Even recordings of their private conversations about the marriage being an elaborate fraud designed to steal my assets and destroy my life. But Harris uncovered something even more disturbing and criminal. I wasn't Derek's first victim by any means. He'd been engaged twice before in the past decade, both times backing out at the last minute after the women had signed similar prenups and transferred significant property or assets to his family. The first woman, a dedicated social worker named Jennifer, had been so completely destroyed financially and emotionally that she'd attempted suicide and was still in intensive therapy 3 years later, living with her parents and unable to work. The second victim, a skilled nurse named Patricia, had lost her house, her life savings, and custody of her young daughter from a previous marriage when Derek's family manufactured extensive evidence of her supposed mental instability and substance abuse. Margaret helped me dig even deeper into the family's extensive criminal history, and what we discovered was truly horrifying. We found a systematic pattern going back decades of predatory marriages specifically designed to consolidate wealth and social power. Derek's grandfather had perfected this system during the Great Depression, systematically targeting desperate women from good families and stealing their ancestral properties through elaborate fraudulent marriage schemes. His father had modernized and refined the approach for contemporary times, focusing specifically on professional women with modest but stable assets and spotless reputations who could enhance the family's social standing while being systematically exploited. They specifically and deliberately chose teachers, nurses, social workers, and nonprofit employees, women who trusted easily because of their naturally caring dispositions and had strong moral compasses that made them less likely to fight dirty in court or expose family secrets publicly. Women who wouldn't be easily believed if they tried to expose what had happened because the family's sterling reputation and extensive political connections protected them from consequences. The investigator also uncovered the family's extensive network of corrupt officials throughout the state. Judges who owed their elections to substantial family donations. Court clerks who would mysteriously lose important documents that might favor the victims. Child services workers who would rubber stamp custody decisions without proper investigation. Even licensed therapists and physicians who would provide predetermined diagnoses for the right price. As my wedding day approached, I felt like I was preparing for war instead of celebrating marriage. Margaret and I had assembled a comprehensive legal case that included not just Derek's adultery, but detailed evidence of the family's entire criminal enterprise spanning multiple decades. We had extensive financial records, sworn witness statements, audio recordings, video evidence, and even brave testimony from some of their previous victims who were willing to come forward once they learned they weren't alone and that someone was finally fighting back effectively. The wedding day arrived with typical over-the-top family fanfare, but I felt like I was walking into the most important battle of my life. 200 carefully selected guests filled the historic cathedral, including business partners, politicians, judges, and social elites who had no idea they were about to witness the climax of an elaborate criminal enterprise being exposed. Derek's mother had insisted on the biggest, most expensive wedding the town had seen in decades, complete with a 12-piece orchestra, exotic flowers flown in from Ecuador, enough champagne to float a yacht, and a reception that cost more than most people make in 5 years. As I walked slowly down the aisle in the designer gown his mother had chosen, not the dress I'd wanted, but the one that met their exacting standards for family appropriateness, Derek looked absolutely triumphant. He was practically glowing with satisfaction and anticipation, probably already mentally spending his inheritance and planning how to dispose of me efficiently. His father nodded approvingly from the front row, probably calculating how this marriage would boost their social standing and create new business connections with my family's modest but respectable reputation in the education community. His mother dabbed delicately at her eyes with an expensive lace handkerchief, playing the role of the emotional mother of the groom to perfection while wearing diamonds that could have funded a small country's annual budget. The entire scene was perfectly orchestrated theater designed to cement their social position, and they thought they'd pulled off another flawless performance in their long history of successful deceptions. The ceremony proceeded normally through the traditional opening prayers and scripture readings about love and commitment. Derek squeezed my hand affectionately during the reading about love being patient and kind, and I had to resist the overwhelming urge to laugh at the bitter irony. When the officiant began talking about marriage as a sacred covenant between two people who loved each other unconditionally, Derek actually smiled at me like he genuinely meant every word. We reached the critical moment about objections, and Reverend Williams asked in his traditional solemn voice if anyone present knew of any reason these two people should not be joined together in holy matrimony. The cathedral was completely silent except for the gentle rustle of expensive fabric and the thundering tick of my racing heartbeat. Then I cleared my throat loudly. Actually, I said in a voice loud and clear enough for everyone in the cathedral to hear perfectly, I have something extremely important to say before we proceed with this ceremony. The cathedral fell into absolute, deathly silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Derek's face went completely white, then flushed red, then went white again as realization began to dawn on his features. His mother gripped her pearl necklace like it was a lifeline, and his father half rose from his seat with alarm written across his face. I pulled out a thick folder from my bouquet, carefully hidden behind the white roses and baby's breath for weeks, and handed it directly to Reverend Williams with steady hands. These are legal documents proving beyond any doubt that my husband-to-be has been in a committed romantic and sexual relationship with another woman throughout our entire engagement, I announced clearly and calmly. According to the prenuptial agreement he insisted I sign, adultery results in immediate and complete forfeiture of all inherited assets to the wronged spouse. The collective gasp that echoed through the cathedral sounded like a massive wave crashing against rocks. Several elderly women in the back started whispering frantically to each other with shocked expressions. A few of Derek's business associates looked genuinely stunned, while others seemed to be rapidly calculating how this explosive scandal might affect their own deals and relationships with the family. Derek lunged forward desperately and tried to grab the documents from the officiant's hands, but Reverend Williams stepped back protectively and opened the folder with trembling fingers. His face grew progressively pale as he scanned the first damning page. The adultery clause takes effect the moment we officially marry, I continued in a calm, measured voice that carried throughout the silent cathedral. Which means if we complete this ceremony, everything Derek stands to inherit becomes mine immediately and permanently. His substantial trust fund, his significant stake in the family business, his extensive real estate portfolio, and his precious car collection. Derek's mother shot up from her seat like she'd been electrocuted by her diamond bracelet. This is absolutely ridiculous and outrageous, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a banshee. You can't prove any of these wild accusations. This is our family's wedding day, and you're clearly having some sort of complete mental breakdown. I smiled serenely and gestured toward the back of the church, where Victoria sat frozen in absolute horror. She'd come as Derek's invited guest, probably planning to watch her boyfriend's performance while wearing the expensive diamond earrings he'd given her for her recent birthday. Victoria has been attending intimate family dinners as Derek's +1 for many months, I said in a clear, carrying voice. She's also been living in the luxury apartment Derek's trust fund pays for on Riverside Drive, the same apartment where they've been planning this elaborate deception for over a year and laughing about how naive and trusting I am. Victoria tried desperately to shrink down in her pew and become invisible, but 200 pairs of eyes had found her immediately. She was wearing the red designer dress Derek had bought her during their romantic trip to Paris, the same trip he'd told me was a boring business conference. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a strangled, desperate croak. You're completely and utterly insane. This is supposed to be my wedding day. You're having some kind of severe psychotic episode. Someone should call a doctor immediately. Actually, I said calmly, handing him another even thicker folder, this is the day you lose everything you've spent your entire privileged life believing you were entitled to steal from innocent women. The second set of documents was even more damaging and comprehensive. It detailed not just his current affair, but his family's entire documented pattern of financial abuse, fraud, and systematic exploitation, going back 3 full generations. The previous fiancés who'd been coerced into signing over property or taking on massive debt in their names. The elaborate shell companies used to hide assets from divorce settlements and tax authorities. The systematic exploitation of dozens of women desperate for love and security. The extensive bribes paid to judges, court officials, and other professionals to ensure favorable outcomes in family court. The network of corrupt professionals who helped them destroy their victims' lives, reputations, and financial stability. I'd spent weeks gathering this overwhelming evidence with Margaret and Harris. We'd built an absolutely airtight case that would expose decades of fraudulent marriages, systematic financial manipulation, and criminal conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of innocent women's lives while enriching the family. Derek's father tried desperately to intervene, standing up and using his most commanding courtroom voice, the one that had intimidated countless people over the years. This is clearly a private family matter that should be discussed behind closed doors in a civilized manner. There's absolutely no need to air personal grievances in front of our guests and the entire community like this. No, I said firmly, turning to face him with steel in my voice and fire in my eyes. This systematic destruction stops today. Your family has spent generations destroying women for profit and entertainment, and I absolutely refuse to be another victim in your long line of casualties. I turned to address the entire stunned congregation, many of whom were leaning forward to catch every word of what was obviously the most dramatic and scandalous wedding they'd ever witnessed in their lives. Derek's family has spent generations systematically trapping women in predatory marriages, I announced to the captivated crowd. They specifically target teachers, nurses, social workers, and nonprofit employees. Women with naturally good hearts who trust easily and don't have the financial resources to fight back effectively when they're inevitably betrayed and discarded. They promise love, security, and partnership, then systematically steal everything and destroy us when we're no longer useful to their elaborate schemes. The The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, gasps, and whispered conversation. Several women in the audience looked genuinely stricken and horrified, and I realized some of them had probably experienced similar situations with other wealthy families in our social circles. Harris had hinted during his investigation that this pattern of predatory marriage wasn't unique to Derek's family. It was actually fairly common among certain established old money dynasties throughout the region. Derek made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative and salvage his rapidly crumbling reputation. "You're making the biggest mistake of your entire life," he said, his voice shaking with rage, panic, and dawning realization. "My family has extensive connections throughout this state and beyond. Judges, prosecutors, business leaders, politicians at every level. We can systematically destroy your career, your reputation, everything you care about in this world. You'll never work as a teacher again anywhere." I actually laughed out loud, right there in front of God and 200 witnesses. The sound echoed off the cathedral walls and seemed to hang in the air. "With what money exactly?" I asked, savoring the look of dawning horror and complete helplessness on his face. "The moment I walked down this aisle, you triggered the adultery clause in your precious prenup. Your trust fund is now legally mine. Your stake in the family business is mine. Your real estate portfolio is mine. Your precious car collection that you love more than any human being is mine. Even this ridiculously expensive wedding, which cost more than most people's houses, is being paid for with money that now belongs to me." His mother's face had turned an alarming shade of purple with uncontrolled rage. "You manipulative little bitch," she hissed venomously, abandoning all pretense of dignity and social grace. "This is pure extortion. This is criminal blackmail. We'll have you arrested and thrown in prison where you belong." "No," I said with perfect calm, pulling out my phone to show crystal clear recordings Harris had made. "This is justice served cold after years of planning, and it's all completely legal according to the prenup your son insisted I sign without bothering to read carefully." Reverend Williams, clearly overwhelmed by the three-ring circus his simple wedding ceremony had become, asked in a shaky voice if we were proceeding with the ceremony or not. His hands were visibly trembling as he held the damaging documents. "Absolutely," I said with a radiant smile. "Derek, do you take me to be your lawfully wedded wife, knowing that saying yes will cost you everything you've ever valued, cared about, or considered important in your life?" Derek stood there completely trapped like a wild animal caught in an expertly designed snare. If he said yes, he'd lose everything to me through the adultery clause that his own high-priced lawyers had approved without question. If he said no, he'd be publicly admitting to the fraud and would probably face serious criminal charges for the financial crimes we'd so thoroughly documented. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, while 200 people watched him realize that his entire life of privilege, entitlement, and systematic cruelty was crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Some guests were openly recording on their phones. Others were whispering frantically to each other with shocked expressions. A few were already quietly slipping out the back exits, probably trying to distance themselves from the scandal before it completely consumed them too. The officiant cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I'm afraid we need a clear answer to proceed with the ceremony," he said as gently as possible under the circumstances. "Finally," Derek whispered in a completely broken voice, "I can't do this. I can't marry her." The congregation erupted in complete and utter chaos. Derek's mother was screaming about family reputation and how I destroyed an innocent man through manipulation and lies. His father was already frantically on his phone with their expensive lawyers, barking orders about immediate damage control and media management. Several business associates were quietly but quickly slipping out the back exits, probably trying to distance themselves from the scandal before it destroyed their own carefully cultivated reputation. Victoria had completely vanished, probably running back to whatever rock she'd crawled out from under. As the crowd dispersed in confused and excited clusters, with everyone talking at once about what they'd just witnessed, Derek approached me one final time. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled and disheveled, his perfectly styled hair was messed up, and his face was red with humiliation, rage, and the dawning realization of everything he'd lost. "You've completely destroyed my entire life," he said with bitter hatred in his voice. "I'll never forgive you for this betrayal. My family will never forgive you. You have absolutely no idea what you've done or what the long-term consequences will be for you." "No," I replied with perfect calm, gathering the train of my wedding dress with dignity intact. "You destroyed your own life the moment you decided to treat people as disposable possessions and sources of profit instead of human beings worthy of love, respect, and basic human decency. I just exposed what you've been hiding and gave you exactly what you deserved." The legal aftermath was swift and absolutely brutal for Derek's entire family. With the overwhelming evidence Margaret, Harris, and I had systematically gathered, they couldn't contest the prenup or claim fraud on any grounds. The adultery clause was completely ironclad, written in the exact same complex legal language as the rest of the document that their own high-priced lawyers had drafted and approved without question. Their extensively documented history of financial abuse spanning multiple decades made them look even worse in court, especially when several of Derek's previous victims came forward with their own harrowing stories once they realized they weren't alone and that someone was finally fighting back successfully against the family's reign of terror. The criminal investigation that followed uncovered layers of corruption that shocked even seasoned prosecutors. 3 sitting judges were indicted for taking substantial bribes over many years. A dozen court officials were charged with evidence tampering and document destruction. Several licensed therapists lost their credentials for providing false diagnoses in exchange for money. 2 child services workers were arrested for falsifying reports. The family's entire network of enablers and accomplices came crashing down like dominoes in an earthquake. The media coverage was relentless and devastating. Local newspapers ran front-page stories for weeks. National news outlets picked up the story as an example of generational wealth being used to systematically destroy innocent people. Social media exploded with women sharing their own stories of financial abuse by wealthy families. The hashtag that emerged from the coverage helped thousands of women realize they weren't alone in their experiences. Derek's business empire collapsed within months. Partners withdrew from deals, investors pulled funding, and clients canceled contracts. The family's reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that they couldn't operate in their previous social circles. Derek's mother was quietly asked to resign from every charity board she'd served on. His father's law practice lost most of its clients within 6 months. I used Derek's substantial inheritance, which turned out to be even larger than I'd imagined, including assets hidden in offshore accounts, to start a comprehensive foundation helping women escape predatory relationships and rebuild their lives after financial abuse. We provide extensive legal aid with top-tier attorneys, comprehensive therapy services with trauma specialists, temporary housing in safe locations, job training programs, financial counseling, and even relocation assistance when necessary for safety. Within 2 years, we'd helped over 300 women across 5 states and had opened satellite offices in 3 major cities. The foundation is named after Jennifer, Derek's first victim, who became one of our most effective counselors and advocates after finally getting the specialized help she desperately needed. She's now married to a genuinely kind man and has adopted 2 children who adore her. We also established a legal clinic that takes on cases against other predatory families pro bono. Margaret leads the legal team and has become something of a legend in family law circles for her willingness to take on powerful, corrupt families. We've exposed 4 other similar operations and helped send dozens of criminals to prison. Victoria disappeared completely after the wedding debacle, probably returning to whatever life she'd had before becoming Derek's accomplice in emotional terrorism. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another state and was working as a real estate agent under a different name, trying to rebuild her reputation far from the scandal. Derek moved across the country to work his first regular office job at an insurance company. He's living in a cramped studio apartment in a city where no one knows his family name, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and probably learning what real life feels like for the first time in his privileged existence. His social media accounts, when he bothers to update them, show a dramatically different lifestyle than what he was accustomed to. Chain restaurants instead of country clubs, public transportation instead of luxury cars, discount stores instead of designer boutiques. The last I heard, he was seeing a court-mandated therapist as part of his probation from the fraud charges. Apparently, he still doesn't understand what he did wrong and continues to claim he was the victim of an elaborate scheme. His therapist reportedly described him as having narcissistic personality disorder and being completely unable to accept responsibility for his actions. His parents lost most of their social standing when the full extent of their crimes became public knowledge. They had to sell their mansion, their vacation homes, and most of Derek's father's car collection to pay legal fees and victim restitution. They moved to a modest house in Florida, essentially becoming social pariahs who couldn't show their faces in the community they'd once dominated. Derek's father was disbarred and faced multiple criminal charges. He served 18 months in minimum security prison and now works as a paralegal for a small firm that handles minor civil cases. Derek's mother developed severe depression and anxiety, requiring hospitalization twice. She rarely leaves their small house and has become something of a recluse. His mother still sends me angry, bitter letters every few months, written in her distinctive handwriting on expensive stationery that's probably left over from their wealthy days. The letters claim I ruined an innocent man and destroyed a respectable family for my own selfish gain. She insists Derek was a loving fiancé who made minor mistakes that I blew out of proportion for financial gain. I have them all framed in my office now, displayed right next to the photo from what would have been our wedding day, and the newspaper article about our foundation's work helping abuse survivors. Sometimes I read them when I need motivation to keep fighting for other women, reminding myself of the mindset that creates these predators in the first place. The ripple effects of exposing Derek's family continued for years. Other wealthy families in similar situations were investigated by law enforcement and journalists. More victims came forward with their own stories once they realized they weren't alone and that people would believe them. An entire network of predatory marriage schemes was exposed and systematically shut down across multiple states. The story became a cautionary tale that was covered extensively in national media about financial abuse and the particular vulnerability of women who trust too easily. Law schools now use our case as an example of how prenups can be weaponized. Several states changed their laws regarding prenuptial agreements to provide better protection for vulnerable parties. A documentary film crew followed our foundation's work for 2 years and created an award-winning film that aired on major networks. The exposure brought in millions of dollars in donations and helped us expand our services nationwide. We now operate in 15 states with plans to go national within 5 years. The most rewarding part has been watching our clients rebuild their lives. Jennifer not only recovered but became a powerful advocate who speaks at conferences nationwide. Patricia regained custody of her daughter and started her own nonprofit helping single mothers navigate family court. Dozens of other women have gone from being broken and traumatized to becoming strong, successful advocates for others. Sometimes people ask if I feel guilty about what I did to Derek and his family. They suggest that maybe I was too harsh, that I should have just quietly left instead of systematically destroying so many lives and causing so much public scandal. They argue that everyone deserves forgiveness and second chances, that revenge is never the answer to personal problems. The answer is always simple and immediate. I don't feel guilty for 1 second about protecting myself and countless other women from a family of systematic predators who viewed marriage as just another business transaction designed to enrich themselves at others' expense. Derek's family had spent generations perfecting their system of emotional and financial abuse. They had destroyed dozens of women's lives without any remorse or consequences. They would have continued their pattern indefinitely if someone hadn't stopped them. What I did wasn't revenge, it was justice. There's a crucial difference between the two. Revenge is about inflicting pain for personal satisfaction. Justice is about stopping ongoing harm and protecting future victims. Everything I did was legal, carefully planned, and designed to prevent other women from suffering the same fate. Derek thought he was incredibly clever with his elaborate prenup scheme, following in his family's well-established footsteps of legal theft and emotional manipulation, refined over multiple generations. He never considered that someone might actually be smarter than him, that a simple elementary school teacher might have resources, intelligence, and moral courage. He'd completely underestimate it. He made the classic mistake that many predators make, believing his own superiority and assuming that everyone else was just a pawn in his carefully orchestrated game. He thought my kindness was weakness, my trust was stupidity, and my modest background meant I was powerless against his family's wealth and connections, but I played to win, and I won everything that mattered. More importantly, Derek's downfall sent a message throughout our community, and beyond, that wealthy predators aren't untouchable, that their money and connections can't always protect them from consequences, and that their victims aren't as powerless as they believe. The foundation continues to grow and help more women every year. We've prevented countless marriages like mine and helped hundreds of women escape similar situations before they were completely destroyed. We've changed laws, exposed corruption, and created a network of survivors who support each other. Derek lost his money, his reputation, and his future, but dozens of women gained their freedom, their dignity, and their lives back. That seems like a fair trade to me.